t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime. Tu m'avais manqué, Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime. T'es ma préférée, Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime.
Hello there and welcome to Brussels, My Love, your News' weekly chat show that breaks down the highs and lows of EU policymaking. I'm Maeve McMahon. Thanks for tuning in. Coming up this week, all eyes on Germany. The EU's economic powerhouse went to the polls last weekend and voter turnout was impressive. Over 8 in 10 people cast their ballot and most called for change. Although the Christian Democrats came out first, a takeaway from the night was the rise of the far-right AfD, especially in the east of the country. We hear how the EU capital has been reacting to the high-stakes elections and ask what's next. And from Sweden to Austria, Germany to France, there's been a spike in terrorist atrocities of late, mostly carried out by lone wolf attackers in apparent copycat style. The incidents have polarised the political sphere. Meanwhile, here in Brussels, a turf war between local drug dealers has triggered a wave of deadly street violence, begging the question, is the EU capital a dangerous city? We take a look at the surge in violence in our public space and ask what can be done to address the security risks. A warm welcome to our guests this weekend. Bruno Waterfield, Brussels correspondent with The Times. Sophie Poinschlegel, French-German political scientist with the Jacques Delors Institute. And Kim Smouter, the Executive Director of ENAR, that's the European Network Against Racism. Thank you so much to you all for being with us. But as usual, before we bring in your views and your insights, let's just get the latest on the challenges facing the aspiring German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz.
The Chancellery in Berlin. Some scoff that the building looks like a washing machine. This is the place from where Friedrich Merz is supposed to govern the third largest economy in the world. But whether the Christian Democrat will be able to whitewash the policies of the outgoing Red-Green coalition is doubtful. He needs the Social Democrats as a partner, the party that Olaf Scholz just led to an electoral disaster of historic proportions. Friedrich Merz must feel like he's entering an arranged marriage with a partner on life support. Not ideal conditions for success. Finding consensus on defense and Ukraine might be easier than on migration and climate. The question now, can Germany display its full power in Brussels again? Or will German leadership hide behind abstentions in the European Council?
So, all eyes on Friedrich Merz. Sophie, we look at you first, just for your takeaways from these elections. It looks like a really strong vote against the governing traffic light coalition.
Yes, that was definitely the case. The Conservatives won, the far right won with over 20% of the vote. And interestingly enough, also the far left won after a divide with the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, which is a left-right party, I would say, because she's on the right on migration. And the left had more than 9% of the vote. So that was quite interesting as well.
But for now, it doesn't look like Germany's back in the EU arena just quite yet, Bruno.
No, it isn't. And it's for the sort of centrist groupthink that has governed Germany for decades. It's an absolute disaster. The SPD, worst results since Imperial Germany when it was a radical populist party. In fact, the CDU are going to form, poor old Merz is going to be the Chancellor with their second worst result since 1949. When you look at the vote and the fragmentation of the vote as well, I agree with you, the Die Linke vote, particularly among young people, one in 4 young people voted Die Linke, is absolutely fascinating. But the real lesson of it is that the centrists who've been running Germany and have taken, made catastrophic policy decisions for which they're being hammered rightly, have been beaten. And the game is over. What the new world is going to look like, we don't know. Is it going to be alternative for Germany? Who knows? I don't think they did particularly well. They didn't make the kind of breakthrough that has happened elsewhere. But I think the game is over. And I think that's going to be the lesson people are going to draw here.
Kim, what about you? What have been your response and the wider response here from Brussels to these elections?
I would tend to absolutely agree. So I think one of the things that we're definitely seeing is that this is actually a story that's not specific to Germany. So we see that actually these electoral results have actually been replicated in other European member states. And what we see indeed is this polarization of votes. So we have this retreat of the center left, the center right, and essentially the vote is going in two directions. Either it goes more far left, and that's what we're seeing. So we actually do see that progression of the far left in lots of different places, or indeed it's going to alternatives, AFD, the far right. And I think here we really are starting to have a battle across Europe for what kind of Europe do we want to actually have moving forward. Is it a Europe where we divide, or is it a Europe where we find a new narrative which federates and brings people together?
Well, the message here is we need a strong Europe, and many have been saying this week, in order to have a strong Europe, we need a strong Germany, because Germany has been missing. Olaf Scholz has been called the wrong man around the EU summit table, Bruno.
Well, I mean, Germany isn't what it was. You know, it's not the Germany of Wolfsprung Dirk technique or whatever. I don't speak German, but they've been losing hundreds of thousands of skilled manufacturing jobs. It's deindustrializing. They're becoming very similar to countries like Britain and the Netherlands, relying on often cheap foreign labour from within the single market, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Poles, which isn't good for wages. It's not good for investment in productivity. German productivity isn't a pretty picture. Its infrastructure is crumbling. The absolutely insane decisions that were taken on energy dependency on Russian gas, not least closing down nuclear power stations. So I think, Germany isn't what it was. And I think one of the things that's quite exciting about this result, highest turnout since Germany was reunified, very exciting. This actually could be about renewal. It could be about changing the groupthink, getting rid of the groupthink, and having something new coming into the world. And I think Germany really needs that. It's a great country, has a great contribution to European civilization and culture, literature, philosophy is amazing. And we kind of need Germany back, and it's not going to be helped.
And we're so used to Germany running so smoothly and so well, so it's unusual to look at the country fall apart over the last couple of years. But let's just show our viewers how the vote went, because you can see there on the map, it is quite clear that there is a big divide in Germany, an east-west divide. If you look at the socialists there, they're still strong in their home bases, but the CDU, the Conservatives, did very well everywhere. Only a tiny smattering of green on that map. And if you see Berlin there, obviously a different colour to the rest of East Germany. And also in Thuringia, AfD won 38% of the votes there. Sophie, really, people feel ignored by the mainstream parties, and they also feel like, what you mentioned, they don't really have the same wages people do perhaps in other parts of Germany.
Yes, I think you could see that also with the regional elections last year, especially in the eastern Bundesländer, where there was a surge of the far right. Clearly, there's been, these are also the effects of a reunification that seem to be doing well, but in the end, economically, it wasn't very successful, and it has political repercussions. I think what Bruno said on the economy is really important. There has been a lacking investment in infrastructure for years now. If you take the train in Germany, you will see it, but also in the digital infrastructure.
Is the fiscal debt break to blame for this?
That's
this
one
famous
of the big
debt
issue.
break.
But also the question now is, with the Conservatives in power, are they going to change that, or are they going to continue having an austerity policy direction? And I think that's going to be the biggest question, because in the campaign, migration was the biggest topic, but in the end, it will really be the question on the economy that will be crucial in the next 4 years.
And Angela Merkel even mentioned that in her memoir, the importance of tweaking this fiscal break in order to make sure that, the company can get back on its feet.
But there is a real big problem, because we're going to get another coalition of the people who've failed, catastrophically failed. There's no guarantee at all that this election, which has said game over to the centrists, is going to change anything. That has consequences 2 or 3 years down the line, when there's probably going to be another election. This Brandmauer idea, which is rooted in historical analogies that simply do not apply. Germany 2025 is not Germany 1933. It also draws a political wall down the country, because it seals off the former GDR East Germany behind a political wall rather than a literal concrete wall. And I think that is a really, really big problem. I think people really need to grow up. And in Germany, it's very difficult because of the history and the power of those analogies. But you should not, those analogies, those legacies are very, very important. But they shouldn't be used as an excuse to
Kim, you want to weigh in there?
Yeah, because what I find interesting, if you look at that split, is that actually that split is not just in Germany. So if you look at kind of the results in the Netherlands, if you look at the results in France or in Belgium, it's the same group of people who are voting in this way. And what you can see, it's those communities which feel that they've been de-invested in. These are communities which feel abandoned, which indeed don't feel like that the center has any more their back, in essence. And that's been going on for many, many years. I mean, the center left and the center right are both equally to blame with regards to the types of failures of policies that has been talked about for many years. I mean, these are not new topics, these are not new challenges, these are not new issues. But clearly the center has been unable to deliver the kinds of results that people feel the people that are in the power, the seats of power, have our backs, they know where we're going, and they can communicate to us in a way that we feel secure, that our future will be guaranteed moving forward. And instead what they're hearing is, your pensions are going to be longer, we're going to not be able to invest in social policies or yourselves, we don't know what the future is, AI might replace you. So all of these things are leading to this insecurity, and the only people who seem to have a response to that is the far right with a very simplistic message which blames migrants for it.
And Alice Weidel, the face of the AfD, so the Spitzen candidate, if you like, she's been presenting herself with very clear messages to her voters. We can actually take a listen to her now speaking the other night just after those results came in.
We have doubled our votes. They wanted to cut them in half. The opposite has happened. And I must say one thing. Our hand will always remain outstretched for participation in government, to implement the will of people, the will of Germany. We are ready to participate in government.
So Alice Weidel, Sophie, is ready, but nobody wants to go into government with her.
No, that's true. Even Merz said that he wouldn't, which is good news because at the end of January, there was a vote in the Bundestag where the Conservatives basically decided upon a migration package that wasn't even legislative. It was just really just for the show with the votes of the AfD. And that really was the start of a breakdown of the firewall, which was tactically not very smart because it will make negotiations also with the Social Democrats and potentially the Greens. I mean, now it's mostly going to be with the Social Democrats, very difficult. And so the question really is whether the Conservatives will continue with that firewall or whether they will continue.
And how will they be able to, considering how popular the AfD are?
Yeah, and I think also the difficulty, and this is what we're seeing across Europe, is that, okay, the AfD didn't win enough votes to get into power, but their ideas have managed to get into power. Because actually the way that the CDU and the way that Christian Democrats and Conservatives are countering the rise of the far right across Europe is essentially by adopting all of the policies which are being championed and usurping and using it themselves. And that's the risk, in essence, of the AfD coming through the back door.
Alice Weidel, she's a big fan of Margaret Thatcher. What would Margaret Thatcher think of Alice Weidel and her policies?
Thatcher didn't like demagoguery. She didn't like referendums. She had a rather complicated relationship with democracy itself, actually. So I'm sure she wouldn't be. She wouldn't be very bad. She was very anti-German, of course. That's why she ended up leaving power, because she couldn't stomach a reunification of Germany. So yeah, she'd of course be, absolutely horrified. But I think, look, one of the problems in Germany is look what has happened to the political class. So in 2021, the great star was this guy Robert Habeck. He's gone. He was, he was the centrist pin-up. He was going to be the next chancellor. He's had to resign. He lost in his own constituents. And his relationship with voters is fascinating. This is the guy who called in prosecutors when he was teased on Twitter in November last year. And I think this kind of fact of an elite's relationship to voters, which is contemptuous quite often, calling in the police when people say things that they don't like, I think that was actually quite a big factor in the election. If you look at working class support for AfD, it's 38%. It's gone from 6% in 2013 to 38%, because AfD does have a different relationship. What the AfD is bringing back, and this is why it gets taken up elsewhere, isn't really, the politics of the Nazi party or fascism. They're quite democratic.
Well, it is mentioning words like remigration.
Well, remigration, but
which is extremely far right. I mean,
remigration is.
Maybe bring in there.
One of the things is that what's interesting compared, for instance, to the French far right is that the German far right really went further to the right. I mean, they have parts that are, under surveillance by the constitutional service. I mean, which is like the internal domestic services checking whether they're neo-Nazis. They have someone like Björn Höcke in it, so they're not even trying to go to the center. They're going going to the right.
And they were even too right for Marine Le Pen.
Exactly. So that really says a lot.
Well, that's because he was German. There's German Nazis in France.
But now, of course, we're seeing Viktor Orban flirting with Alice Weidel, and rumours in this town that they would potentially join the Patriots for Europe party. But let's go back to Die Linke, because we discussed Die Linke, how popular they are. They've had also very strong messages online talking about issues like social justice, also the war in Gaza. And we actually had a chat with one German MP from Die Linke. His name is Atis Gorpenar. And he discussed also this rise of the AfD in the East. Take a look.
In recent years and decades, we have repeatedly seen the fight from the so-called center against those who actually have the least. Refugees, recipients of social benefits. And this is something that the AfD has taken up for its own brand essence. But I don't think it's just an Eastern phenomenon. It is perhaps a little more popular in the East because conditions are a little worse there. People there are worse off overall. They are poorer. And some of them don't look upwards, but instead look downwards and thus follow what the AfD, but also part of the center, have increasingly claimed in recent decades.
Was die AfD, aber auch Teil der Mitte in den letzten Jahren, Jahrzehnten immer mehr behauptet haben.
So Atis Gorpenar there speaking to us from Berlin, also blaming the centre. So a lot of soul searching now will have to take place for the Socialist Party as well, Bruno.
Yeah, absolutely. And
are they done? Are they toast?
I think the SPD is done. Thankfully, once great party, should finally be buried, and it's appropriate that Scholz does that.
You disagree?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, of course, you can see that it decreased in the last years. I think they had a really difficult, tripartite coalition with the Liberals and the Greens, so it was extremely difficult for them. And I think they've also suffered from the fact that they were in grand coalitions all the way with the Conservatives, which makes it hard for them to kind of, redefine themselves when they're not in the opposition. So I think that's really a bit of a difficulty for the Social Democrats.
The centre-left definitely has to do some soul searching, and also looking a little bit at the traffic light government. The policies were not that much different from what's going to be championed by the CDU. So the centre-left has completely abandoned its fundamental values, and this is a problem across Europe. Across Europe, the center-left has to reimagine what a future of Europe looks like that is more inclusive, and that is currently not resonating.
So the problem with the centre-left, and this is why the AfD have done well. The AfD have, ethno-nationalists within their ranks. We saw, Maxi Boy going back into the Bundestag. They have ethno-nationalists in their ranks, but it's not. Their support isn't ethno-nationalist. That's not how they win votes. They win votes on the basis of pretty old-fashioned nation-state politics. It used to be the politics of social democracy. In fact, a nation state is very important if you're a social democrat. A radical social democrat like myself, a nation state is absolutely vital. That's how you carry out your programme, and you represent people's interests. And that's fascinating. You look at the AfD rallies across Germany, working class rallies, is they talk like social democrats. They become much more sort of Farage, pint and a cigarette.
Well, I just wanted to go back to what you just said about the Social Democrats, and I think what you could see in the Traffic Light Coalition is the position that the Social Democrats have taken on migration was very much on the right. I mean, they were for border controls against Schengen, for remigration to Afghanistan and Syria, which are, countries that are at war or with the Taliban. So it wasn't really a social democratic agenda, and I think that really made it difficult. But I would also agree that, the Social Democrats tend to have like a social agenda, which is not in the center anymore. Now it's identity politics. It's very much about these polarizations, and that's when the far right is winning.
Yeah, and also how the Linke is actually gaining ground. So in essence, those who would normally vote center-left have a tough choice. Either they fall to the side of the AfD, or they say, I'm going to stay true to my left ideals, and I go even deeper into the left, and that's where Die Linke gets.
But here at Your News, we've been speaking to a lot of kind of under 30 brackets, and they're very disappointed in the outcome, and they really don't think that Friedrich Merz represents them. Last week in Cologne, I spoke to Lukas Zieper. He's actually a German MEP. He's 27 years old. Take a listen to how he feels about Friedrich Merz.
I think he will be a chancellor of the old times. Which for me is very unfortunately. I don't think he's going to be up for the challenges. I'll always remember that the best chancellor that we had in the last decades, which was Angela Merkel, got rid of him in 2006, and I think there was a good reason for that. As much as I hate this term because it's used by anti-democratic people, he is pure establishment. Basically, he is this old-fashioned style of politics where you have interest groups that have the most influence, where you barely listen to the people directly, and frankly speaking, he is also just too old. He cannot represent the young people and also not the medium-aged people.
Lukas Sieber there expressing his dismay with the Chancellor, saying he's quite frankly too old. So very disappointed German youth there.
Well, the thing is, Germany is an old country, so, you know, the demographics is that the youth is not very well represented. What I found really interesting is that almost 30% of the young people between 18 and 24-year-old voted for the left. And I think that, you know, not only social media, we'll discuss it later, had played a role, but also the fact that they voted for the left and for the AfD, which means that the center democratic parties really have an issue with, you know, speaking to young people.
And I think a lot of the De Linke vote was actually a vote in support of the firewall. I think polling went up, but the TikTok went viral after the
speech by
vote
Heike
in the Bundestag. Yes,
and the speech by Heike,
yeah. So I think that's kind of interesting. I think that is kind of interesting. But I really, you know, I want to come back to something really, really important. You know, voters don't like it when politicians say, look, some things are more important than you. The EU is more important than you. EU asylum policy, even if it doesn't work, is more important than your interests, even your safety, as people perceive it. Refugee conventions are more important than how we govern our country. And one of the problems the SPD has is it's very bolted into that kind of mindset. And I think that's the problem in Germany.
So how will Friedrich Merz act? Will we see a collision course with President Ursula von der Leyen on some policies?
I think it's difficult to see. I mean, as I said, I'm not sure to what extent will the CDU not involve the AfD through the back door, in essence. So I think it will be interesting to see whether there would be more of that kind of thing. And I think you're absolutely right. You know, how does the establishment finally listen to the signal which has been sent to them multiple times that they need to start listening to the people and that they need to start delivering on that?
We can bring this very interesting conversation to an end. Thank you so much to our panellists and thank you for watching. Stay with us though, because after this break we'll be telling you about the latest turf wars here in Brussels that have seen a spike of unprecedented violence on the streets of the EU capital. See you soon. Welcome back to Brussels, my love, your News' weekly chat show where we're just looking back at the news of the week. And one topic we wanted to take a look into was the spike of isolated attacks that we've seen across Europe of late. Last week in Mulhouse, a man who was on a terror watch list killed 1 and injured 5 policemen. Meanwhile in Berlin, a man injured a Spanish tourist in an anti-Semitic attack. And just before the Munich Security Conference, we saw a car drive into a protest killing 2. Not to mention the mass killing in Sweden last month, the Magdeburg car attack and the Aschaffenburg knife attack as well. Now, it's worth pointing out, these attacks are nothing like the terrorist attacks that we've seen a few years ago in Europe, but they're still being very much instrumentalised by politicians. What's your assessment on this, Kim?
I think that's exactly the problem, that it's being instrumentalized and that it's being used to make social commentary over. And I think that's creating the sentiment of insecurity that's spreading across Europe, and also a search for who is to blame. And I think that's the dangerous game that's currently being played, is who is to blame and the necessary kind of actions that are being undertaken. So I think the over-reliance on policing as the only response to these kinds of actions is particularly worrying.
There seems to be a spike in this kind of copycat trend. What's your assessment of the situation, Bruno?
Well, the attacks you talked about are largely carried out by people who are lone wolves, but who have an Islamist motivation. There is a certain pattern of attacks being carried out by people who don't even have a right to be in that territory, people who have a track record of violence. And people do say, and it's very, very understandable, it's quite legitimate, they say, you know, it's becoming too normal. It's becoming too every day. You go to a Christmas market, there are roadblocks to protect it from people driving cars into the crowds. Let's remember, a lot of the people who die in these crowd events are people of immigrant origin themselves in Germany. Let's not forget that. It's very, very, very important. But people say, look, you know, I don't like having to go to a Christmas market that's surrounded by a security cordon. Look at the carnivals this week. There's a big alert on in Belgium at the moment because of ISIS Telegram accounts. people aren't happy when they go to a carnival, something they've done forever, something that's supposed to be a moment when the community comes together, and they feel a bit under siege. And I think you have to be really explicit about this discussion, and you do have to talk about the motivations of the people who do it.
And you also have to discuss the other side of the coin, which is the increase in attacks as well on asylum seekers, on migrants, on their accommodations as well. There was 2,000, I was reading, just last year. But Friedrich Merz, he wants to address this issue because it is a concern for people. He wants to do so by introducing border checks, having stricter migration control. Will this work, or could it just add fuel to the fire?
I feel like there's a very strong focus on attacks with people with migration background. That's also, covered by the media, and there's less of a media coverage on extremist attacks, for instance, from the far right, where violence also has increased and the numbers show it. And I think what's interesting to see is that generally there is an increase in violence, which maybe also not only is reflected in the public, sphere, but also in real life now. And one of the biggest issue I find is that it's very easy finger pointing what's happening rather than actually addressing the root causes, which is a lack of integration policy, lack of funding also. I mean, a very concrete example, I had a friend who came from Iraq in Berlin and he couldn't work for 3 years. So because no one allowed him. So of course, what do? You have a young man who's like 27 who can't work for 3 years. What is he going to do? And that's you're creating basically the ecosystem for more crime, for resentment and for frustration. So I think it's really up to the governments to take this on.
And the COVID pandemic didn't help either. That's according to one security expert that we spoke to, Claude Moniquet. He's a former Secret Service agent. Take a listen to his view.
Security measures in Europe have been significantly strengthened after the period we experienced between 2014, marked by the attack on the Jewish Museum in Brussels, which was the first attack by the Islamic State in Europe, and 2017, which saw the Barcelona attacks and the end of the Islamic State's territorial control in Syria and Iraq. Today we are simply witnessing the return of a threat that has always been present. It has remained roughly at the same level, though it has likely worsened with COVID. During the lockdown, many young people were deprived of school and real social interactions, spending their time only in virtual spaces, which led a number of them to be radicalized online by propagandists. Today we are paying the price with very young actors, and two countries that remain highly targeted are France and Germany.
Claude Moniquet there, a former Secret Service analyst. So this is an issue that really needs to be addressed, this radicalisation online.
Yes. Look, I think it's really important to note something, that there is a big, as we've just been talking about, a big sucking vacuum at the heart of Western European societies like Germany, Belgium, France. There's real confusion over values, there's real confusion over democracy with political elites who are pretty contemptuous of most people. The economy doesn't work for most people. Communities are felt to be under siege and in decline. The police often seem, to some people, it's a bit of a caricature, but it has an element of truth, to be more concerned about policing people's Twitter accounts than catching a guy who should be locked up.
But there's
My concern is that indeed we're taking these lone attacks, these lone wolf attacks, and we're painting it on communities. So in essence, communities are being asked to defend themselves. This is again something which has happened for decades. They're being asked to defend themselves for something that they have had no responsibility for. And also, we're still not going back to the root causes. These are communities which are underinvested for many, many years. These are communities which are excluded from the political life. We have now political parties which are asking for re-immigration for people which have been here for decades. That creates the environment for these things to happen. That's the concrete impact of these things. And that's why it's really important to reinvest in our communities, indeed to invest also in security, but to make sure that police and security are never the only answer. You always need to have also a strong investment in social policies for it to actually create an ecosystem which creates inclusive bonds, which creates bonds between communities, and which enables radicalism to be rooted out.
Yeah, I think you have to have a really honest discussion, and that means, sometimes you do have to talk about Islamist motivation. Islamism isn't something that necessarily paints a community. I've got lots of German and Turkish friends who would not like to be called Muslim, for example. So there is the painting of communities as being Muslim, for example, when they're Turkish, Indian, Bangladeshi, Arabs of the Maghreb, Arabs of the Middle East, is insane. I mean, really, really insane. So I think we need to have a very honest discussion.
Yes, we need to have an honest discussion. At the same time, I really agree that, it's dangerous to go like from one end to basically say it's your fault, and then it fuels Islamophobia. And I think we've seen that after the terrorist attacks as well in Belgium and in France, where they're considered second-class citizens and nothing is done to make sure that they are more equal. And I think that as long as this is still the case and you're not investing and you're still allowing these people to feel like they don't belong, I think we will see that continuing. And I think that's something we really need to address, and that requires investments and money as well.
Okay, and on that point, we can bring this conversation to an end. For more on that story, you can take a look at our website, euronews.com. Thank you so much, though, to our guests for being with us. And thank you for watching. See you soon here on Euronews. Hello there and welcome to Brussels, my love, Euronews' weekly politics show. I'm Maeve McMahon, and along with our panel, Bruno Waterfield, correspondent with The Times, Sophie Punchlegel, French-German political scientist, and Kim Smouthett, Executive Director of the European Network Against Racism. We're just taking a look back at the news of the week. And one that turned our heads was this, even though it wasn't a surprise. A new survey that says young people are using social media as their main sources of news. TikTok, Instagram, YouTube have replaced newspapers and TV and radio for many under 30s. And according to the study, 1 in 2 teens trust TikTok and trust Instagram much more than any other platform. So Bruno, I'll bring you in here, of course, as a journalist for a very established old newspaper. How does this make you feel?
I think it's fantastic. It's a revolution. Love it. Absolutely love it. I think there are real questions to be answered, particularly about who owns these platforms, as we call them, or publishers. There are real questions. And I think you look at the TikTok, which is essentially switched off in the United States. I think there's it's not a free speech question when platforms can be owned by unaccountable foreign corporations who might actually be acting on the behest of states who are not your friends. So I think there's those questions, and I think it's a lot of catching up to do for traditional journalists and publishers like myself. But, having to run a race is fantastic. Let's do it.
But what about giving context on stories that can be very complicated and very difficult?
And also very instrumentalized. And I think that's the problem with social media, is that indeed we haven't gotten, or regulatory hasn't caught up to the fact that it needs to be treated almost in the same way, in the same care as traditional press. At the same time, I think indeed social media gives a lot more voices, a lot more space, which can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing depending on how it's used. So I think that intentionality of how social media is used, that's something which we need to really look at. And I would say the third thing is, how do we ensure that we as people in society are equipped to be sufficiently critical over the content that's being spread on social media, sometimes for nefarious ends, and sometimes indeed for efforts to try to bring more social awareness on issues.
And we're not equipped enough. Maybe just to kind of say, yes, it is a new development, but, the algorithm polarizes. I've seen it myself. It does so automatically. Secondly, there's a lack of moderation we've seen. So there's hate speech there, which is getting really bad, especially on X. And thirdly, the ownership, which was mentioned, is really difficult because it is our data in the end. And it's used, for third parties, for advertising purposes. And we're not quite sure in which hands it will fall either. And with the US administration, I'd be really careful about that.
I would actually add also on the free speech point as well. What's interesting is that there's an American model of free speech that's being imposed on Europe. But actually, Europe has a different approach to free speech. We allow free speech, but to the extent that it doesn't harm others.
That's actually a really arguable point if you look at the European history and tradition of the free press, the unlicensed press, and of free speach. I mean, it's really very questionable. Very, very questionable. There were many hate speech prosecutions in the 1920s and the 1930s against people like Goebbels.
Yeah, but for now, I'm sorry, but
Fritz,
for instance, if you look at vulnerable groups or women receiving tons of hate mail being in a talk show, look, I'm sorry, that's not free speech.
And another concern, according to a Reuters report as well, with this AI-generated content as well, there's a lot of women, they're completely absent from videos, and you often see male hosts with big microphones just speaking to male guests. But let's just ask young people in this town whether they agree with this report. We were out on the streets of the city of Brussels asking them where they get their news. Take a listen.
I'm looking to TikTok and then I see videos of the news and all.
I look at the different accounts of newspapers like Le Monde, Le Canard Enchaîné, etc., which I actually have here right now.
I mainly use Instagram and YouTube to inform myself about actualities.
Now everything is digital, so I just look at, for example, the Politico app or the Economist or the Financial Times, and I also subscribe to their newsletters.
I tend to use Twitter, now it's called X. I normally follow there all the accounts of the different newspapers that I actually trust or I like.
I use Instagram a lot, so I will see the information on Reels usually, so it can be a bit biased because of the algorithm.
I don't really watch TV a lot. It's just I go through my phone and all the time I'm using TikTok or Instagram.
So many different answers there. A lot still following traditional papers, in fact, actually, and signing up to newsletters and subscriptions, because that's what will keep you in a job.
Yeah, absolutely. People need to pay for stuff. But I think there's a really important point that Sophie made. I think it's really, really important is for social media, like the unlicensed press 200 years ago, holds a mirror up. And it's often pretty unpleasant. I mean, I look in the mirror in the mornings and doesn't get better as you get older, I can assure you of that. And so, yes, I mean, some of the things Sophie was talking about are really important. One of the things that's really needed, actually, in our European societies at the moment is a new wave of feminism, actually, because some of those debates have simply slipped.
You disagree? You're nodding your head.
Well, the thing is, it's biased. So I think it's, yes, of course, it's great to have a feminist as a social movement. But the issue is that if you have a platform where the algorithm is already biased, and when you have things like the manosphere, which has like an incredible influence, also on voting behavior, when you have Andrew Tate's or Joe Rogan's that have such a great following, it has implications also for social values and how people vote.
And Kim, we've seen that generative AI is racist, and it's also rather right-wing. I was reading some reports.
Absolutely. I mean, we're actually creating a society full of echo chambers, which don't speak to each other anymore. And social media accelerates that. And indeed, on the other side, artificial intelligence creates a very unlevel playing field. So I think if you look at kind of how political parties or particular political movements are investing massively without any sort of, we're not playing with very fair weapons in there.
No, absolutely not. I mean, newspapers doing pretty well at the moment. Print editions are actually doing surprisingly well, a bit like vinyl. I say it every time, but a bit like vinyl. No, look, there's a battle going on, and instead of running away from the battle, you have to get involved in the battle. And yes, I mean, there are really big accountability questions on anonymity, for example, also on the algorithms. It just comes back to who owns these platforms, how do they monetized, how do they work? They're simple questions of public accountability, but, it's a good, to have the mirror held up to us and not to like it is a good thing. We can't start cancelling elections.
Yes, you want to make your point, your final point?
Yeah, maybe just to kind of also find compromise there. I think that, it's a reality, and we've seen it that young people use those platforms. So the question is, of course, how political parties use it, and we've seen that the far right is extremely good at using TikTok, for instance, the far left as well. Centre parties, not so much. And the second thing is also, and I know this is not in the trend right now, but I think having regulation like the DSA and the DMA from the EU, so the Digital Services and Digital Markets Act, is actually something good. And I hope that we won't be blackmailed by the US to stop that. And I know there's a deregulation wave at the moment, but, having regulation on those things
tech
is really important.
Untouchable. That's the word from Brussels. And on that point, we could bring this conversation to an end. Thank you so much, Bruno Waterfield, correspondent with The Times, for being with us. Sophie Poinschlegel, French-German political scientist, and Kim Schmeiter from ENAR. Thank you for being our guests. And thank you so much for watching. If you want to reach out to us here, brusselsmylove@euronews.com. That is our email address. You can also catch us on any of those social media platforms that we've just been discussing. But for now, thanks for watching. See you soon.